It's a beautiful summer day. You're taking a walk through the park in your brand new pair of $500 Nike Mags, the 2015 reissue of Marty McFly's self-lacing shoes, made famous in the 1989 classic Back to the Future 2. Your walk takes you past a shallow pond. You suddenly notice a young child has fallen into the water near the bank and is drowning. You could wade into the water a few steps and easily save the young girl, but your expensive collector's edition shoes would certainly be ruined. Virtually everyone would say that you are required to make this sacrifice, that you are required to save this child's life at the cost of your shoes. But why is it then that society doesn't make the same requirement of other good deeds, like donating to UNICEF? Why are you required to save one child's life at the expense of your shoes, but not required to save dozens of lives through charitable donation? What's the difference between these two actions? Stick with us, and maybe you'll find out.
Hey everyone, welcome to You've Got It All Wrong, a philosophy podcast for handsome people like you. I'm Paco Allen.
I'm Mark Sanders.
And I'm Chad Allen. So on today's show, we're going to talk about supererogation, and that's the technical term for a class of actions that go beyond the call of duty. Just a brief note on the Latin etymology of that kind of weird word. In Latin, you would probably say something like supererogare, where super means beyond or extended, and erogare is duty or action. And so these are literally actions that go above and beyond the call of duty. And the reason we're interested in these kinds of actions today is because they are kind of a weird thing. And up until the middle of the 20th century or so, most moral philosophers kind of categorized human actions into one of three buckets. Things that you were morally obligated to do, things that you had to do. So good actions, but ones that you had to do. Morally prohibited actions, so like bad stuff that you're just not allowed to do.
Murder.
Like murder. And then permittable actions.
Subprime mortgages.
Yeah. Subprime mortgages, a moral duty? Oh, no, the opposite.
No. Yes.
Right.
The opposite.
Sorry.
Or I mean, in the case
Depending
of
on
like
who
modern
you are.
America, permitted. Not good, not bad,
Right,
but
so
permitted.
that's the third category of actions, right?
Subprime
Permitted.
mortgages
Yeah.
is the third category.
What
Good
color
things,
is his
bad
collar?
things, and subprime mortgages.
Yeah.
And so in 1958, an American philosopher named J.O. Urmson wrote an article called Saints and Heroes, in which he outlined this fourth category of actions, actions that are morally good but not required. And these are the supererogatory actions. And these are things like giving to charity or volunteering or throwing yourself on a hand grenade that's been tossed into a crowd of soldiers, writing that check to UNICEF that Mark talked about in the intro to the show. That's kind of like a classic supererogatory action. It's praiseworthy and it's morally good, but I don't think most people would say you're absolutely like fucking required to write a check to UNICEF, right? But I think the fundamental tension in Mark's story is, what's the difference between sacrificing your $100 shoes to save this girl who's right in front of you and writing a check for $100 to save a girl or potentially dozens of girls from a terrible life in Africa?
So I think, like, to put it another way, which is something that we talked about before the show, which is kind of like made a lot of sense to me, is that we all have a really strong intuition that there are good things, that there are good actions in life that we should do. But we also feel like everybody shouldn't be required to do every good act. You know, like it would be like really hard to live your life if you were required to do every single thing that was good. But when you try to break this thing down logically and figure out like what is a supererogatory act and what is just a good required act and what's the difference between those two things, it becomes a lot more complicated than just, I just have this general intuition that here's this good thing to do that's a required good thing. Like, feed my child versus feed somebody else's child halfway across the world through some donation through UNICEF. But when we try to break it down, like we're going to try to do on the show today, those two things are much harder to separate as separate types of actions.
I mean, there's one line of thinking in which they're just basically the same thing, right? You're exchanging money that you have for the well-being of someone who's less well off than you, whether they're drowning in a shallow pool of water or whether they're starving to death in a developing nation.
So I think, Chad, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are a handful of different ways that philosophers have looked at this paradox or this issue of
yeah, sure. So like, you know,
so like, how do we deal with like supererogatory acts, and should I be donating to UNICEF or just feeding my kids?
Well, so one tack to take is to just say, okay, well, this dilemma is going to force us to conclude that there's no such thing as a supererogatory action. That basically it is true that if you would trash your $100 shoes to save this girl from drowning in a shallow pool of water, that you also should write that check to UNICEF. And so this line of reasoning is basically like, you know what? We were kind of wrong about that intuition we had, that not everything is required. And if you break it down, it turns out everything is required. And so you should be leading a very austere life in which you donate most of your money to charity and or spend most of your time working on charitable projects.
So when you say there's that one option of dealing with the conundrum of how to define supererogatory acts versus required good acts versus evil, not permitted acts, is to just say supererogatory acts don't exist. All good actions are required.
Right.
So there's no like optional good deeds.
Yeah, that position just basically says like J.O. Urmson was wrong and there like isn't a fourth category of stuff. There really are only three categories: stuff you should do, stuff you shouldn't do, and stuff that's like whatever, you can do it if you want. Like subprime mortgages.
Right. Good stuff, bad stuff, subprime mortgage.
Right, that's
okay. So what's the argument against that argument? Because in philosophy, all arguments have counter arguments.
Right. And counter arguments.
Yeah.
Well, I
basically, you'll learn nothing from this podcast in the end, other than how to argue like a jerk at the bar at night.
Right. Well, isn't that the subtitle of the podcast?
Mm-hmm.
The tagline? How to argue like a jerk at the bar.
Yeah. Well, when we do the book, that'll be the...
Oh. When does the book comes out in time for
next
Christmas,
month.
Right?
Yes.
Oh, next month. Yeah, just in time for Christmas.
Philosophy Christmas.
Yeah, well, the other side of the argument is basically like, look, we have this strong intuition that there are some things that are good to do but not required. And if we give up on that category of things, then no one's really doing anything praiseworthy ever, right? So we like to say, oh, like Paco worked at the soup kitchen on Christmas, and so that's like a praiseworthy thing that he took the time to do that. And that's sort of like how we think about the world, right? Like we think about some people as like doing things that are really extraordinary. But if it turns out that we're all just like required to do all of the good things that we possibly can, then we have to do away with the idea that anything is praiseworthy because everybody's just doing what they're obligated to do.
And there's also the practicalities of if you try to focus on only doing good things for everybody else, then you would innately not be holding down a job, not moving money around in the economy, not taking care of indirect actions that would otherwise be positive to other people in ways that aren't necessarily positive right now.
And I think that would be sort of like the counter argument from a utilitarian perspective, is that like sophisticated versions of utilitarianism try to carve out sort of like projects. They're sometimes called agent relative projects, like projects that are specifically important to you. And those could just be things like going to your job, like they're important to you in a very kind of everyday sense, like you have to do it to earn money. And so there are some like projects or endeavors that aren't necessarily benefiting other people directly, but you have to do them in order for the world to like keep turning. So like I think there is like a sophisticated version of the argument that there's no fourth category of things that is something like, yeah, you can't spend all of your money on charity, you need to like pay your bills and stuff. But you should be spending most of your leftover money. Like, you shouldn't own that fucking speedboat. Right. I gotta say, I love hanging out on your speedboat. So,
because in a perfect world, if everybody attempted to perform every action into the benefit of everybody else, if as a result there was an accident or you lost all your money through an otherwise fortuitous act, then everybody else who's also doing the same thing would also come to your aid, and you'd be the recipient of exactly that same good charity that you'd be given to other people.
Wait, do you get a speedboat?
Yeah, you didn't know that?
I've never been on the speedboat. Okay, so just to circle back real quick, one approach to like resolving the issue of supererogatory acts, part of my mind goes to like super
irrigation.
Super erotic acts.
That's our other podcast,
yeah.
Dude.
But that would also benefit other people. Well, it depends how you do it, I guess.
Yeah. So like one option is just say no, like you're having trouble deciding like what's supererogatory and what's a required good action. Well, guess what? Like the supererogatory actions don't exist. All good actions are required, right? And the counter argument is that if that were the case, like everyone would spend all of their time ever until the end of time doing good things, and things like watching football on Sunday when you could be working at the soup kitchen would be
totally forbidden,
immoral, and in some societies, if you take it to its like end point in terms of law and civics, would be illegal. Like you could and then football wouldn't exist,
right?
Because no one would be able to watch it,
right?
And
interesting.
Sounds like a horrible place to live.
Yeah, a world without football.
A world without Tom Brady.
Well, things like, from a business point of view, if research and development doesn't produce an actual output, be it negative or positive, in this case, for the purpose of explicitly helping another person or people with a charitable value, that also wouldn't have a place, even though we know indirectly research and development in the abstract and the academic goes towards producing many valuable charitable.
I, for one, don't want to live in a world where the Superbowl Shuffle couldn't have existed.
Well, then you do not want to live
in supererogatory land.
Yeah.
Coming to Disney World 2016.
Yeah, what's that ride like? There's just like lots of pools full of drowning girls to jump over.
Yeah. Like everybody gets a pair of like there's a movie tie-in with the Back to the Future 40th anniversary edition. Well, no, it's 2015, right? So the tie-in is everybody gets a pair of sweet self-lacing
Nike Mags,
Nike Mag $500 shoes, and you can keep those, or you can walk, or you
can save small children.
Yeah. Yep.
They probably have a saving small children mode in them as well.
The shoes?
The shoes, yeah.
Oh, so you don't even have to do any work? Yeah.
And they're self-lacing. Like,
they're self-lacing.
What don't they do? Self-saving,
But they destroy themselves in the process. Like, if you activate the self...
Yeah, no, they inflate so much that they're basically like pontoon shoes, but it destroys the seams.
Weren't there inflating shoes back in the 80s? Like you used to be able to pump them up?
Yeah, the Reebok pump.
This episode brought to you by Reebok. I'm pretty sure like that's where like the weird like Nike self-lacing thing may have come
from. Was it Reebok that had the pump?
Yeah. This is the worst part of the show, I promise. Okay, so option number 2 for resolving this issue.
I'll be the judge of that.
Is basically that like it's kind of the old like without good there is no evil, without evil there is no good.
Right.
If these actions aren't supererogatory, like if they aren't optional, then like the concept that we all feel is an innate part of being a human being and living in society, the idea of going out of your way to help somebody, or like doing something extra, or like seeing somebody out in society throw their coat down in over a puddle of water to let somebody walk across, or whatever, that no longer exists. If everything's required, then there kind of aren't good acts and bad acts. There's just
required
shit and required stuff and prohibited stuff.
Right. And that's like, on some level, that's like a huge problem in 20th century Anglo-American analytic philosophy, is that like you take these strong intuitions that we have and then abuse them by analyzing the shit out of language, right? So I don't think you're ever going to convince people that all of these acts are required. And by convince them, I mean, I don't think you'll ever reach a place where where that intuition is not sort of overwhelmingly compelling. Like if I give you a theory that says your intuition that giving to charity is optional is wrong, like that's just a theory it doesn't have a lot of legs.
I would say that you wouldn't be able to get everyone to agree on what is a beneficial act. Like one person's act of, well, I'm going to give you vegetables to help you grow big and strong, is another person's punishment. Like, oh, you're going to give me vegetables. I hate vegetables. Like It could be the fact that the thing that you need isn't the thing that you want.
Yeah, how does like that aspect factor into it? How do you...
Everyone has to agree subjectively on exactly the same terms of what is the optimum act.
Right. But the issue's separate from that. I think like the issue of whether or not there are acts that go above and beyond the call of duty is like somewhat.
It presupposes a state where people could agree on what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah, because that question exists within any moral framework, allegedly, right? So, we may have different ideas about what's right and what's wrong, but we might both agree that within our own respective frameworks, there are some things that are above and beyond the call of duty.
Now that you've heard all these perspectives on supererogation, if you believe that you should ruin your shoes to save this girl,
designed by Tinker
why
Hatfield,
aren't you going to iTunes right now to rate us and then directly to UNICEF to donate?
Yeah, in that specific order, because frankly, the good that this show creates in the world is probably outweighing the good created by the survival of. No, sorry.
No. I mean, no. Let's play that out to its end.
Yeah.
The more people that listen to this show, specifically to this episode,
right,
and understand that they should be donating to UNICEF
because it's fucking mandatory,
the better, right?
Right.
And the only way that we're going to get the most people possible listening to this episode and understanding they should be donating to UNICEF is if you go rate this show in iTunes. Like, it's probably actually more important that you rate this show in iTunes than it is that you donate to UNICEF.
Right, because somebody else will donate to UNICEF.
Yeah.
That's how I always think about UNICEF.
We make it up on volume.
Yeah. Here's the deal. If your last name starts with the letters A through N, go rate this show in iTunes. If your name first, and then go donate to UNICEF. If your name ends in M through Z, donate to UNICEF first, and then come back and rate us in iTunes.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Operator's standing by.
No,
what?
The UNICEF operators are doing all the work, man. We don't have to do anything.
They're pretty sure they have a website.
Yeah, look, I'm going to go home and sleep well
iTunes
tonight.
Operators? iTunes, which app would you like to rate?
You don't call into to download your iTunes? Operator. This is Pennsylvania 365.
All right, well, I think that's as good a place as any to stop and let that all sink in. Let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
Hey everyone, it's Mark. We just wanted to take a few seconds and thank everyone for listening. And if you're enjoying the show so far, there's something we'd like to ask you to do to help us out. It's not required, so I guess you could call it a supererogatory favor. Head over to iTunes and give us a review. And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe to the show. Ratings, reviews, and subscriptions are the main factors that determine whether we get noticed and the podcast becomes a weekly fixture in your ears. We'd really appreciate the support. That's enough groveling. Now back to the show.
Hey, Mark, thanks for doing all the groveling for us, and welcome back to the show, everybody. We wanted to use the back half of the show to kind of step away from the heavy philosophical arguments and talk about some of the things that got us interested in the topic of supererogation in the first place. And so I think if you sort of trace it back, a little ways, not too far, maybe a couple of thousand years, it kind of like the concept first comes to us in a story about Jesus from the New Testament, right?
Yeah, so I think another reason why this sticks out to us is because it involves a term that I think everybody's familiar with, and everybody has, again, kind of an intuitive understanding of what it means. But we certainly didn't know the origin of this until we started to kind of get into, researching some of the backstory of this topic, and that is the term Good Samaritan. So this is a story. That, like Chad said, goes back to, some of the parables from the Bible, and is basically a story that Jesus told when he was asked what...
Allegedly.
Luke 10:25 to 37.
Yeah, thanks.
Allegedly.
Allegedly, Luke 20. No, I mean, I'm pretty sure that's where it comes from literally, but
allegedly Luke wrote it.
They probably took it from the Mithrathic cult.
Yeah.
The what?
Mithras, the bull that was born in a stable to a virgin birth under a star and visited by 3 wise men. The whole concept of the nativity that was taken from Mithras, the bull god.
No, I didn't know that. But yeah, so I'm sure what you're saying is the story of the Good Samaritan was probably lifted whole cloth from some other parable from some earlier religion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They'd also found it useful for exactly the same reason.
Right.
Yeah,
because
but
there's nothing fucking new. What the hell, religious inventors? Come up with a new idea. Okay,
yeah, no, I mean,
Samaritan.
You guys have heard the one where Jesus was trying to reclaim this lost artifact from this tomb, and he uses this bullwhip to swing across this crevasse.
Oh yeah, that's in that's in one of the lost gospels, right?
Yeah,
Thomas, one of the apocrypha.
Yeah, the one from the cave. Yeah, the cave gospel.
Yeah, and then he's got like dance across the floor where there's different stone tiles on the floor that trigger booby trap, poison darts.
This is Jesus, right?
Yeah, and then he gets to the end of that hallway, and he's got a bag of sand in his robes, and he's got to replace a solid gold statue of a head with a smaller bag of sand.
I don't remember reading this part of the Bible.
It may have been a hollow gold. It may have been just like who knows how
golden calf.
And Greedo shot
perhaps.
first. And Greedo shot first, right, Mark? Bullshit. I feel like we ruined that whole thing.
We.
I was trying to get to the Good Samaritan. You're the one off on the tangent with the fucking bulls and shit. All right, the Good Samaritan. So, the Good Samaritan, that's like a term that we all know and throw around every day, every time somebody does something that's intuitively supererogatory. But I don't think any of us really knows the origin of that. So this is a story that Jesus told when he was basically questioned by one of his followers.
Allegedly
told and was allegedly asked by one of his followers. It basically what the definition of neighbor was in relation to, be good to thy neighbor.
Yeah, because in Leviticus, your neighbor was basically some other dude who's basically exactly like you.
Yeah. So Jesus' his response was basically to tell this story about this traveler who was walking down a road, and I think there's some indication that this traveler in the original stories was probably a Jew, and he gets basically gets jumped and beat up, and all of his goods and possessions are stolen, and he's kind of left for dead on the side of the road. And then, various travelers come by, a priest comes by of unknown religion or origin, just a priest comes by and total jerk, just like moves to the other side of the road and like walks past.
La 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 la.
Yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't
Yeah.
like wade into a shallow pool with his.
Nope.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Maybe
then,
he's busy wading into a shallow pool.
Right. I
baptizing
got other
someone.
stuff to do, like save this little girl.
Yeah, like there's a small. I mean, if there was a small, shallow pool of water that a girl was drowning in on the other side of the road,
you know,
like,
don't you
that's a
think that
different-
like if I had been around, like Jesus would have been like, "Hey man, shut the fuck up and stop asking all these stupid questions." Like I feel like this is us like talking to Jesus. We'd just be like constantly interrupting him.
Please send your email to Chad Allen.
yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I don't know why Jesus didn't just answer like everybody,
Yeah.
like why he felt he had to tell this story, but he apparently did tell this story. So, anyways, priest walks by.
Priest
a
walks into a bar.
a priest, Santa Claus, and the Easter Bunny all walk into a bar.
A priest,
There's a
Santa
man
Claus, and the
who's-
Easter Bunny walk by this
Yeah.
guy on the side of the
Yeah.
road.
I mean, basically, that's what happens is like a bunch of different people from a bunch of different places that I assume like back in the day, like all had specific meaning about like
Right.
why the Levite from Levi wearing Levi's jeans like walked
So
past this
racist,
guy.
yeah.
And like, yeah,
Oh,
I'm sure there was,
everybody
like-
from Levi wears Levi's.
yeah, I'm sure there were reasons why like everybody walked by and like ignored this dude, like this Jew like on the side of the road who's been like beaten up and all of his stuff's been stolen and he's been left for dead. I'm sure there were like, that's probably why Jesus didn't just say like everybody and he told the story. It was because
Right.
there were like subtle barbs at everybody in the crowd, like, oh yeah, I'm looking at you, Levites.
Right.
Tax collectors.
But eventually, a Samaritan walks by, and the Samaritans were supposedly had like bad relations with the Jews. They didn't get along. They were kind of, like
They were just dicks.
yeah, they were jerks. But this particular Samaritan, this Good Samaritan, stopped and bandaged the traveler's wounds. Poured oil on his wounds, poured wine on his wounds. I think
What
basically
is it, like Bear Grylls
yeah, it
stopped
was
by? And
no, I mean that's how the story goes. Basically, like anything that he had that was liquid, he just like poured on this guy.
Yeah.
And also he like had a first aid kit because he bandaged him up. But then he like takes him to an inn, like puts him up at the inn, pays for the guys.
Really?
Yeah,
I didn't know
like,
this whole story.
pays for the guys lodging.
Now it's getting a little creepy, frankly.
Tells the innkeeper, don't let him out of the room. don't look in the room. I'll be back. No, but he like pays the innkeeper for his lodging and says like I'll come back in a couple days, and if he's accrued any more, like debt because he like needed to eat or
there's like a
there's
roulette table,
prostitutes or there's a roulette table or video poker at the bar.
Mini
like
bar.
I'll cover that.
Keno.
I'll deal with that. So that was basically like Jesus's like super long-winded way of saying that.
/ our super long winded.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's probably like as short as Jesus told it. I think what I'm saying is I think I did as good a job telling that story as Jesus did. Like that was his way of saying that when I say love thy neighbor, by neighbor, I mean every mofo you pass on the street.
Right.
Like treat him as good as you would treat anybody else in the world.
He also said, treat others as you'd like to be treated yourself, which is kind of a faster way of saying the same thing.
Well,
Yeah.
I think like by like his like fourth or fifth, like community gathering where someone was like, yo, Jesus, when you say be good to your neighbor, like,
Is this your like ancient Israelite voice that
No.
you're doing right now?
no, that would be racist. This is my ancient Sumerian voice.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
So it's like every time he got asked, like, what do you mean by neighbor? Do I like really need to be good to Steve because that guy's a dick?
Fucking Steve.
Like he throws his garbage right out his window, like onto the side of my hut. Like eventually Jesus got tired of telling that story and he was
Right.
just like, everybody.
He's just like,
Yeah,
Yeah,
he,
like
fucking everyone is
he,
your
he,
neighbor.
he didn't do the radio cut. He did the 12-inch mix,
Yeah.
for the big crowds.
I mean, I think that he had like somebody wordsmith that shit for him a little bit and got to do
yeah, like
unto-
Matthew, Mark,
do-
Luke, and John.
Yeah, they were all like, do to the other guy like you would want that guy to do stuff to you, and then just like worked at it, wordsmith, and then do unto others as
Right.
you would have done unto you.
Yeah, I think Luke had the unto insight.
Yeah, technically, I think that what we're quoting is Tyndale in the King James edition, rather than the ancient Aramaic.
Fuck off, Mark.
Yeah, it's got to be all about the British kings, doesn't it? All right. Who else found something interesting while we were looking at this?
So right, sorry.
Are we indulging you enough?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, let's talk about indulgences. So it's funny because a lot of the stories are like the sort of origins of supererogation go back to sort of biblical stories or stories about the early church or even the latter-day church.
Well, I think this is probably because, like, obviously, I mean, I think for me, like, what it says is that this isn't a topic or an issue or like a thought conundrum that people have like just come up with in the 1950s. Like this idea of how good do I need to be in society and like what are the required good things versus like what are the good things that I don't have to do. Basically, I think like a lot of people for a long time have been going like, all right, like what's the bare minimum amount of good shit I have to do, right? And so like society, governments, culture at large, and religions have been like trying to
what's
define
the bare minimum we can get away with?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's like kind of like
the Bible, the bare minimum you have to do.
No, like the Bible steps in is like the bare minimum's like way more than what like the average like heathen would say is the bare minimum. Like the Bible comes in and religions I think come in and say like the bare minimum's like a lot.
Yeah.
Right. But I mean I think that's why when we're talking about like where these topics come from and like what are some of like the earliest examples that we know of and like this term the Good Samaritan that's been around for like in the last couple thousand years is because I think like religion has like tried to step in and religious leaders like over throughout history have like tried to step in and say like you should do more than what you would do if like everyone was just left to their own devices to decide what's good to do in society.
By nature we're animals and we're going to take the shortest route through the trees. It's like toddlers don't have any sense of conscience or a sense of diligence to other people. They're very self-centered. We have to have rules. We have to have this outboard brain of contingencies so we can exist as a society.
Anyways, the indulgences. I mean, I think this is like a super interesting, like weirdo thing that happened.
Yeah. So if you go actually all the way back to sort of the early church, there is this notion, the early Catholic Church, this notion of supererogatory actions, and originally were sort of like the it's like this, what does the church call it? The spiritual treasury. Basically, the acts of saints, which are above and beyond the call of duty, generate this sort of like extra goodness or this extra merit that the church can then store up in this treasury and then dispense to other people. So it's kind of like the supererogatory or above and beyond the call of duty actions performed by the saints accrue in this spiritual treasury, and then the church can kind of like dole them out to other regular folks to decrease the amount of penance that they need to serve in for their sins. And so I think it originally like goes back to the martyrs, where the church was basically like, well, man, these like people have sinned and they have asked for forgiveness. So like the sins have already been forgiven, but they're about to die because they're being persecuted for their religion. So they're not going to be able to do their penances. Like, what the fuck do we do? And they're like, oh, we can use this saved up goodness from the saints.
It's bookkeeping, essentially. It's double entry accounting.
Yes, it's credits on the left, debits on the right of like penance, basically. So I think the concept of the indulgences goes back to like the 3rd century when the church like first had this idea of like, oh, we can like stash away this like extra merit created by the saints and then like use it to like make up for other people's inability to like serve their penance.
It was defined in the Creed of Nicaea, right?
Probably.
Was it what?
The Creed of Nicaea, the event where all of the executive bodies of the Catholic Church came together and decided what all the rules were.
Oh, yeah, like for the first time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I think is in the 3rd century.
Yeah, 325.
Well, that'd be the 4th century, but you're probably right.
Yeah.
So, and then, we all know that sort of like the indulgences, like for later on, get this bad rap when in the early Middle Ages, the church starts to sell them off like it's kind of like a raffle. Like, oh, you don't want to do all that penance? Guess what? We've got this giant bank of goodness that you can draw on, so you won't have to like serve all of your penance. And by the way, you can buy some of it. So it's
like a financial instrument, but for faith.
Yeah, basically, it's like, hey, if you don't want to say all of those 500 Hail Marys, like for $50, you only have to say 10 of them. It's kind of like, that's an oversimplification, but that's basically what it came down to.
I mean, is it really an oversimplification, or like that deal right there? You don't think just like straight happened?
I don't know if that specific example happened.
I think Christianity was a free to play game originally. Then they introduced like
it was freemium.
Well, no, it was free. No, originally it was free to play.
Yeah, you just hang out on this hillside with Jesus and just talk about stuff.
They wanted user. They were at that point. It was just about like building a user base.
Right.
They knew they could monetize it later. Then
right, like when the VCs were like, how are you guys going to make money? They're like, whatever, we're just building the user base.
Yeah, and then they went to microtransactions, still freemium,
in-app,
free to play, microtransactions, and I mean that's where the monetization is at. Like you've only got 10% of your users, like doing pay to play, but the long tail on those guys is ridiculous.
Well, especially the ones who like did really bad shit. They have a lot of penance to do, and there's just no way they're gonna get it done without buying some indulgences. Yeah. I mean, the story of it's kind of crazy, and like the church actually talks about it in terms of days. Like the spiritual bank has days in it, and so you're sort of like getting back a number of days of penance that you don't have to do in exchange for a certain amount of money.
So could you like literally buy days off of your time in purgatory?
Yes, yeah, you could literally buy days out of purgatory, and that's kind of how it actually started. Was that the church wanted a way to sort of recognize martyrs as having done something morally good, but the reality was that they were going to have to be forgiven for their sins, and then they were going to have to serve penance for those sins, just like everyone else, but they weren't going to have time to do it because they were going to get like eaten by the lions in the Colosseum or whatever. And so the church decided that it could provide them with these indulgences so that the martyrs wouldn't have to serve out these penances in purgatory after they got eaten by the lions. So originally the indulgences were primarily granted to martyrs to, kind of give them a break in purgatory. And that's how the whole tradition of indulgences start. And, so later you could just like get them by being rich and not have to like say your Hail Marys or whatever.
Or now we have to legislate them.
Yeah, now we have to legislate them, and I think that's what you wanted to talk about, Mark.
Yeah, so a lot of countries, particularly in the Western world, have Good Samaritan laws based on exactly the concept of the parable of Jesus, and they're primarily based in two different camps. The Good Samaritan law that we often hear about in the US and Canada and the UK and Western Europe is around protection for people who are engaged in these supererogatory actions. So doctors that stop at road traffic accidents to help people who may be hurt, who don't want to be sued for malpractice because of complications of.
Because like when you're giving someone CPR, you like break all of their ribs.
Yes,
right?
It's a lot messier than when you see it on the TV shows.
Right.
So that's basically a defense against tort. You're giving people the ability to help their fellow members of society by protecting them against unnecessary litigation. And the other type of legislation is most commonly referred to as duty to rescue. So it's actively requiring people in many countries to perform actions to help other people and go out of their way and be engaged in actively benefiting them.
Right, and that's like, so there's some things there, like that's meant to counteract like what's called like the bystander effect sometimes, where like a diffusion of responsibility is the other phrase for it. So like there are much famous cases like the Kitty Genovese case where and this is in New York City, right, in the 70s or 80s, with this one like being attacked, and there were like 30 people essentially witnessing it from their apartments, and nobody called the cops. And so like the duty to, I think probably like that case might have been like that the duty to rescue laws in the U.S. might have been like a direct reaction to that case.
People are compelled to perform some action.
Right.
Yeah. And you actually see that in featured in the final season episode of Seinfeld.
Right, where they totally fail to rescue, basically, right?
Yes, and someone was being robbed, and they made fun of him, and they were brought up on these Good Samaritan laws, even though that was probably should have been described as a duty to rescue law.
Yeah, Jerry Seinfeld got that shit wrong. Yeah, as usual. Larry David probably also like was in there fucking it up as well. Because they call it Good Samaritan law. Like
they call it.
Is that the title of the episode?
Yeah, I think so.
The one where Jerry wasn't a good Samaritan.
Yeah.
Oh no, wait, that's Friends.
The one where.
No, that's it. We've discussed every possible facet of supererogatory acts
and supererogenous acts,
and
that's the other podcast.
And supererogation, which is
illegal
if
in
you have a lot
California
of crops.
Well, I think that wraps it up for this episode. If you want to donate all your money to UNICEF, that's cool, but it won't help us. So if you'd like to hear more of You've Got It All Wrong, please subscribe to the show and give us a rating in iTunes. It's super, super helpful. And you can find us online at you'vegotitallwrong.net, where you can find show notes for today's episode. You can email us with questions, comments, or recommendations for show topics at feedback@you'vegotitallwrong.net. And you can also follow us on Twitter. I'm at Paco Allen.
I'm at Chad Allen.
And I'm at M. Sanders.